Chapter 38 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold BENNETT. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. The Victory. "Get back into bed," said G.J., having silently opened the window in the sitting-room. He spoke with courteous persuasion, but his peculiar intense politeness and restraint somewhat dismayed Christine. By experience she knew that they were a sure symptom of annoyance. She often, though not on this occasion, wished that he would yield to anger and make a scene, but he never did, and she would hate him for not doing so. The fact was that under the agreement which ruled their relations, she had no right to telephone to him, save in grave and instant emergency, and even then it was her duty to say first, when she got the communication, "Mr. Pringle wants to speak to Mr. Hoape." She had omitted in her disquiet to fulfil this formality. Recognizing his voice, she began passionately, without preliminary, "Oh, beloved, thou canst not imagine what has happened to me," etc. Still, he had come. He had cut her short, but he had left whatever he was doing, and had, amazingly, walked over at once. And in the meantime she had hurriedly undressed and put on a new peignoir and slipped into bed. Of course, she had to open the door herself. She obeyed his command like an intelligent little mouse, and he sat down on the edge of the bed. He might inspire foreboding, alarm, even terror, but he was in the flat. He was the saviour, man, in the flat, and his coming was in the nature of a miracle. He might have been out, he might have been entertaining, he might have been engaged. He might well have said that he could not come until the next day. Never before had she made such a request, and he had acceded to it immediately. Her mood was one of frightened triumph. He was being most damnably himself. His demeanour was as faultless as his dress. She could not even complain that he had forgotten to kiss her. He said nothing about her transgression of the rule as to telephoning. He was waiting, with his exasperating sense of justice and self-control, until she had acquainted him with her case. Instead of referring coldly and disapprovingly to the matter of the telephone, he said in a judicious, amicable voice, "I doubt whether your coiffure is all that it ought to be. I see you had your hair waved today." "Yes, why?" "You should tell the fellow to give you the new method of hair waving, streaming with electric heaters, or else go where you can get it." "New method?" repeated Christine, the Tory, doubtfully, and then with sudden sexual suspicion, "Who told you about it?" "Oh, I heard of it months ago," he said carelessly. "Besides, it's in the papers, in the advertisements. It lasts longer, much longer, and it's more artistic." She felt sure that he had been discussing hair waving with some woman. She thought of all her grievances against him. The Letchford House episode rankled in her mind. He had given her the details, but she said to herself that he had given her the details only because he had foreseen that she would hear about the case from others or read about it in the newspapers. She had not been able to stomach that he should be at Letchford House alone, late at night, with two women of the class she hated and feared, and the very night of her dreadful experience with him in the bomb explosion. No explanations could make that seem proper or fair. Naturally, she had never disclosed her feelings. Further, the frequenting of such a house as Letchford House was more proof of his social importance, and incidentally of his riches. The spectacle of his flat showed her long ago that previously she had been underestimating his situation in the world. The revelations as to Letchford House had seemed to show her that she was still underestimating it. She resented his modesty. She was inclined to attribute his modesty to a desire to pay her as little as he reasonably could. However, she could not in sincerity do so. He treated her handsomely, considering her pretensions, but considering his position, he had no pretensions, not handsomely. She had had an irrational idea that, having permitted her to see the splendour of his flat, he ought to have increased her emoluments, that indeed she should be paid not according to her original environment, but according to his. She also resented that he had never again asked her to his flat. Her behaviour on that sole visit had apparently decided him not to invite her any more. She resented his perfectly hidden resentment. What disturbed her more than anything else was a notion in her mind, possibly a wrong notion, that she cared for him less madly than of old. She had always said to herself, and more than once sadly to him, that his fancy for her would not and could not last, but that hers for him should decline puzzled her and added to her grievances against him. She looked at him from the little nest made by her head between two pillows. Did she in truth care for him less madly than of old? She wondered. She had only one gauge, the physical. She began to talk despairingly about Martha, whom of course she had had to mention at the door. He said quietly, "But it's not because of Martha's caprices that I'm asked to come down tonight, I suppose?" She told him about the closing of the promenade in a tone of absolute resigned certainty that admitted of no facile pooh-poohings or reassurances. And then, glancing sidelong at the night-table where the lamp burned, she extended her half-bared arm and picked up the landlord's notice and gave it to him to read. Watching him read it, she inwardly trembled, as though she had started on some perilous enterprise, the end of which might be black desperations, as though she had cast off from the shore and was afloat amid the waves of a vast swollen river, waves that often hid the distant further bank. She felt somehow that she was playing for all or nothing. And though she had had immense experience of men, though it was her special business to handle men, she felt herself to be unskilled and incompetent. The common ruses, feints, devices, guiles, chicaneries were familiar to her. She could employ them as well as any, and better than most. They succeeded marvellously and absurdly in the common embarrassments and emergencies because they had not to stand the test of time. Their purpose was temporary, and when the purpose had been accomplished, it did not matter whether they were unmasked or not, for the adversary victim, who in any event was better treated than he deserved, either had gone for ever or would soon forget, or was too proud to murmur, or philosophically accepted a certain amount of wile as part of the price of ecstasy. But this embarrassment and this emergency were not common. They were a supreme crisis. "The other lady has had notice too," she said, and went on. "It's the same everywhere in this quarter. I know not if it is the same in other districts, but quite probably it is. It is the end." She saw by the lifting of his eyebrows that he was impressed, that he secretly admitted the justifiability of her summons to him. And instantly she took a reasonable, wise, calm tone. "It is a little serious, is it not? I do not frighten myself, but it is serious. Above all, I do not wish to trouble thee. I know all thy anxieties, and I am a woman who understands. But except thee, I have not a friend, as I have often told thee. In my heart there is a place only for one. I have a horror of all these women. They weary me. I am not like them, as thou well knowest. Thus my existence is solitary. I have no relations, not one. See, go into no matter what interior, and there are photographs. But here, not one. Yes, one, my own. I am forced to regard my own portrait. What would I not give to be able to put on my chimney-piece thy portrait? But I cannot. Do not deceive thyself. I am not complaining. I comprehend perfectly. It is impossible that a woman like me should have thy photograph on her chimney-piece." She smiled, smoothing for a moment the pucker out of her brow. "And lately I see thee so little. Thou comest less frequently. And when thou comest, well, one embraces, the little music, and then, poof, thou art gone. Is it not so?" He said, "But thou knowest the reason. I am terribly busy. I have all the preoccupations in the world. My committee, it is not all smooth, my committee. Everything and everybody depends on me. And in the committee I have enemies too. The fact is, I have become a beast of burden. I dream about it. And there are others in worse case. We shall soon be in the 3rd year of the war. We must not forget that." "My little rabbit," she replied very calmly and reasonably and caressingly, "do not imagine to thyself that I blame thee. I do not blame thee. I comprehend too well all that thou dost, all that thou art worth. In every way thou art stronger than me. I am 10 times nothing. I know it. I have no grievance against thee. Thou hast always given me what thou couldst, and I, on my part, have never demanded too much. Say, have I been excessive? At this hour I make no claim on thee. I have done all that to me was possible to make thee happy. In my soul I have always been faithful to thee. I do not praise myself for that. I did not choose it. These things are not chosen. They come to pass, that is all. And it arrived that I was bound to go mad about thee, and to remain so. What wouldest thou? Speak not of the war. Is it not because of the war that I am in exile, and that I am ruined? I have always worked honestly for my living, and there is not on earth an officer who has encountered me who can say that I have not been particularly nice to him because he was an officer. Thou wilt excuse me if I speak of such matters. I know I am wrong. It is contrary to my habit. But what wouldst thou? I also have done what I could for the war, but it is my ruin. Oh, my Gilbert, tell me what I must do. I ask nothing from thee but advice. It was for that I dared to telephone thee. G.J. answered casually, I see nothing to worry about. It will be necessary to take another flat, that is all. But I know nothing of London. One tells me that it is in future impossible for women who live alone, like me, to find a flat, that is to say, respectable. Absurd. I will find a flat. I know precisely where there is a flat. But will they let it to me? They will let it to me, I suppose, said he, still casually. A pause ensued. She said, in a voice trembling, Thou art not going to say to me that thou wilt put me among my own furniture? The flat is furnished, but it is the same thing. Do not let such a hope shine before me, me who saw before me only the pavement. Thou art not serious. I never was more serious. For whom dost thou take me, little foolish one? She cried, Oh, you English, you are chic. You make love as you go to war, like that. One word, it is decided, and there's nothing more to say. Ah, you English. She had almost screamed, shuddering under the shock of his decision, for which she had impossibly hoped, but whose reality overwhelmed her. He sat there in front of her, elegant, impeccably dressed, distinguished, aristocratic, rich, in the full wisdom of his years, and in the strength of his dominating will and in the righteousness of his heart. One could absolutely trust such as him to do the right thing, and to do it generously, and to do it all the time. And she had won him. He had recognized her qualities. She had denied any claim upon him, but by his decision he had admitted a claim that no money could satisfy. After all, for 18 months she had been more to him than any other woman. He had talked freely to her. He had concealed naught from her. He had spoken to her of his discouragements and his weaknesses. He had had no shame before her. By her acquiescences, her skill, her warmth, her adaptability, her intense womanliness, she had created between them a bond stronger than anything that could keep them apart. The bond existed. It could not, during the whole future, be broken, save by a disloyalty. A disloyalty, she divined, would irrevocably destroy it. But she had no fear on that score, for she knew her own nature. His decision did more than fill her with a dizzy sense of relief, a mad, intolerable happiness. It re-established her self-respect. No ordinary woman, handicapped as she was, could have captured this fastidious and shy paragon. And the notion that her passion for him had dwindled was utterly ridiculous, like the notion that he would tire of her. She was saved. She burst into wild tears. Ah, pardon me, she sobbed. I am quite calm, really, but since the air raid, thou knowest, I have not been quite the same. Thou art different. Nothing could disturb thy calm. Ah, if thou wert a general at the front, what sang-froid, what presence of mind, but I... He bent towards her, and she suddenly sprang up and seized him round the neck and ate his lips, and while she strangled and consumed him, she kept muttering to him, Hope not that I shall thank thee. I cannot. The words with which I could thank thee do not exist. But I am thine. Thine, all of me is thine. Humiliate me. Demand of me impossible things. I am thy slave, thy creature. Ah, let me kiss thy beautiful grey hairs. I love thy hair and thy ears. The thought of her insatiable temperament flashed through her as she held him, and of his northern sobriety, and of the profound, unchangeable difference between these two. She would discipline her temperament. She would subjugate it. Women were capable of miracles, and women alone. And she was capable of miracles. A strange muffled noise came to them across the darkness of the sitting-room, and G.J. raised his head slightly to listen. Repose thyself in the arms of thy little mother, she breathed softly. It is nothing. It is but the wind blowing the blind against the curtains. And later, when she distilled the magic of the hour and was tranquilized, she said, And where is it, this flat? End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 39. Idyll. Christine said to Marie, otherwise La Mère Gaston, the new servant in the new flat, who was holding in her hand a telegram addressed to Hoape, Albany, "Give it to me. I will put it in front of the clock on the mantelpiece." And she lodged it among the gilt cupids that supported the clock on the fringed mantelpiece in the drawing-room. She did so with a little gesture of childlike glee, expressing her satisfaction in the flat as a whole. The flat was dark. She did not object, loving artificial light. The rooms were all very small. She loved coziness. There was a garage close by, which might have disturbed her nights, but it did not. The bathroom was open to the bedroom. No arrangement could be better. G.J., in enumerating the disadvantages of the flat, had said also that it was too much and too heavily furnished. Not at all. She adored the cumbrous and rich furniture. She did not want in her flat the empty spaces of a ballroom. She wanted to feel that she was within an interior, inside something. She gloried in the flat. She preferred it even into her memory of G.J.'s flat in the Albany. Its golden ornateness flattered her. The glittering cornices and the big carved frames of the pictures of impossible flowers and of ladies and gentlemen historic coiffures and costumes appeared marvellous to her. She had never seen, and certainly had never hoped to inhabit, anything like it. But then Gilbert was always better than his word. He had been quite frank, telling her that he knew of the existence of the flat simply because it had been occupied for a brief time by the Mrs. Carlos Smith of whom she had heard and read, and who had had to leave it on account of health. She did not remind him that once, at the beginning of the war, when she had noticed the name and portrait of Mrs. Carlos Smith in the paper, he, sitting by her side, had concealed from her that he knew Mrs. Carlos Smith. Judiciously, she had never made the slightest reference to that episode. Though she detested the unknown Mrs. Carlos Smith, she admired and envied her for a great illustrious personage, and was secretly very proud of succeeding Mrs. Carlos Smith in the tenancy. And when Gilbert told her that he had had his eye on the flat for her because Mrs. Carlos Smith took it, and had hesitated on account of its drawbacks, she was even more proud, and reassured also. For this detail was a proof that Gilbert had really had the intention to put her among her own furniture long before the night of the supreme appeal to him, only he was always so cautious. And Gilbert was the discovery of La Mère Gaston too, and as frank about her as about the flat. La Mère Gaston was the widow of a French soldier, domiciled in London previous to the war, who died of wounds in one of the Letchford hospitals, and it was through the Letchford Committee that Gilbert had come across her. A few weeks earlier than the beginning of the formal liaison, Mrs. Brading had fallen ill for a space, and Madame Gaston had been summoned as charwoman to aid Mrs. Brading's young sister in the Albany flat. With excellent judgment, Gilbert had chosen her to succeed Martha, whom he himself had reproachfully dismissed from Cork Street. He was amazingly clever, was Gilbert, for he had so arranged things that Christine had been able to cut off her Cork Street career as with a knife. She had departed from Cork Street with 2 trunks and a few cardboard boxes. Her stove was abandoned to the landlord, and vanished into London and left no trace. Except Gilbert, nobody who knew her in Cork Street was aware of her new address, and nobody who knew her in Mayfair knew that she had come from Cork Street. Her ancient acquaintances in Cork Street would ring the bell there in vain. Madame Gaston was a neat, plump woman of perhaps 40, not looking her years. She had a comprehending eye. After 3 words from Gilbert she had mastered the situation, and as she perfectly realized where her interests lay, she could be relied upon for discretion. In all delicate matters, only her eye talked. She was a Protestant, and went to the French church in Soho Square, which we called the Temple. Christine and she had had but one Sunday together, and Christine had gone with her to the Temple. The fact was that Christine had decided to be a Protestant. She needed a religion, and Catholicism had an inconvenience: confession. She had regularized her position, so much so that by comparison with the past she was now perfectly respectable. Yet if she had been candid in the confessional, the priest would still have convicted her of mortal sin, which would have been very unfair, and she could not, in view of her respectability, have remained a Catholic without confessing, however infrequently. Madame Gaston, as soon as she was sure of her convert, referred to Catholicism as idolatry. "Put your apron on, Marie," said Christine. "Monsieur will be here directly." "Ah, yes, madame." "Have you opened the kitchen window to take away the smell of cooking?" "Yes, madame." "Am I all right, Marie?" Madame Gaston surveyed her mistress, who turned round. "Yes, madame. I think that monsieur will much like that negligee." She departed to don the apron. Between these two it was continually "Monsieur, monsieur." He was seldom there, but he was always there, always being consulted, placated, invoked, revered, propitiated, magnified. He was the giver of all good, and there was no other Allah, and he had two prophets. Christine sang, she twittered, she pirouetted out of sheer youthful joy. She had forgotten care and forgotten promiscuity. Good fortune had washed her pure. She looked at herself in the massive bevelled mirror, and saw that she was fresh and young and lithe and graceful. And she felt triumphant. Gilbert had expressed the fear that she might get lonely and bored. He had even said that occasionally he might bring along a man, and that perhaps the man would have a very nice woman friend. She had not very heartily responded. She was markedly sympathetic towards Englishmen, but towards English women, no. And especially she did not want to know any English women in the same situation as herself. Lonely? Impossible. Bored? Impossible. She had an establishment. She had a civil list. Her days passed like an Arabian dream. She never had an unfulfilled moment, and when each day was over she always remembered little things which she had meant to do and had not found time to do. She was a superb sleeper, and arose at noon. 3 o'clock usually struck before her day had fairly begun, unless of course she happened to be very busy, in which case she would be ready for contact with the world at the lunch hour. Her main occupation was to charm, allure, and gratify a man. For that she lived. Her distractions were music, the reading of novels, le journal, and les grandes modes. And for the war she knitted. In her new situation it was essential that she should do something for the war. Therefore she knitted, being a good knitter, and her knitting generally lay about. She popped into the dining room to see if the table was well set for dinner. It was, but in order to show that Marie did not know everything, she rearranged somewhat the flowers in the central bowl. Then she returned to the drawing-room and sat down at the piano and waited. The instant of arrival approached. Gilbert's punctuality was absolute, always had been. Sometimes it alarmed her. She could not have to wait more than a minute or two, according to the inexactitude of her clock. The bell rang, and simultaneously she began to play a 5-finger exercise. Often in the old life she had executed upon him this innocent subterfuge, to make him think she practised the piano to a greater extent than she actually did, that indeed she was always practising. It never occurred to her that he was not deceived. Here, Marie, fly to the front door. See Christine's face, see her body, as in her pale bright gown she peeps round the half-open door of the drawing-room. She lives then. Her eyes sparkle for the giver of all good, for the adored, and her brow is puckered for him, and the jewels on her hand burn for him, and every pleat of her garments, visible and invisible, is pleated for him. She is a child. She snatched up a chocolate and put it between her teeth, and so she offers the half of it to him, smiling, silent. She is a child, but she is also a woman intensely skilled in her art. "Monster," she said, "come this way." And she led him down the tunnel to the bedroom. There, in a corner of the bathroom, stood an antique closed toilet stand, such as was used by men in the days before splashing and sousing were invented. She had removed it from the drawing-room. "Open it," she commanded. He obeyed. His little compartments, which had been empty, were filled with a man's toilet instruments: brushes, file, scissors, shaving soap, his own brand, a safety razor, etc. The set was complete. She had known exactly the requirements. "It is a little present from thy woman," she said. "In future thou wilt have no excuse. Sit down. Marie." "Madame." "Take off the boots of monsieur." Marie knelt. Christine found the new slippers. "And now this," she said, after he had washed and used the new brushes, producing a black house-jacket with a velvet collar and cuffs. "How tired thou must be after thy day," she murmured, patting him with tiny pats. "Thou knowest, my little one," she said, pointing to the gas stove in the bedroom fireplace. "For the other room's a gas stove. I am indifferent. But the bedroom is something else. The bedroom is sacred. I could not tolerate a gas stove in the bedroom. A coal fire is necessary to me. You do not think so?" "Yes," he said, "you are quite right. It should be seen to." "Can I give the order? Thou permittest me to give the order?" "Certainly." In the drawing-room she cushioned him well in the best easy chair, and, sitting down on a puff near him, began to knit like an industrious wife who understands the seriousness of war. Nothing escaped the attention of that man. He espied the telegram. "What's that?" "Ah!" she cried, springing up and giving it to him. "Stupid that I am, I forgot." He looked at the address. "How did this come here?" he asked mildly. "Marie brought it from the Albany." "Oh." He opened the telegram and read it, having dropped the envelope into the silk-lined, gilded waste-paper basket by the fender. "It is nothing serious?" she questioned. "No, business." He might have shown it to her. He had shown her telegrams before, but he stuck it into his pocket. Then, without a word to Christine, he rang the bell, and Marie appeared. "Marie, the telegram. Why did you bring it here?" "Monsieur, it was like this. I went to Monsieur's flat to fetch 2 aprons that I had left there. The telegram was on the console in the antechamber. Knowing that Monsieur was to come direct here, I brought it." "Does Mrs. Brading know you brought it?" As for Mrs. Brading, Monsieur—" Marie stopped, disclaiming any responsibility for Mrs. Brading, of whom she was somewhat jealous. "I thought to do well." "I am sure of it, but surely you can see you have been indiscreet. Don't do it again." "No, Monsieur. I ask pardon of Monsieur." Immediately afterwards he said to Christine in a gay, careless tone, "And this gas stove here, is it all right? Have we tried it? Let us try it." "The weather is warm, dearest." "But just to try it. I always like to satisfy myself in time." "Wasser!" she exclaimed, and ignited the stove. He gazed at it absently, then picked up a cigarette, and, taking the telegram from his pocket, folded it into a spill, and with it lit the cigarette. "Yes," he said meditatively, "it seems not a bad stove." And he held the spill till it had burnt to his finger ends. Then he extinguished the stove. She said to herself, "He's burnt the telegram on purpose, but how cleverly he did it! Ah, that man, there is none but him." She was disquieted about the telegram. She feared it. Her superstitiousness was awakened. She thought of her apostasy from Catholicism to Protestantism. She thought of a Holy Virgin angered. And throughout the evening and throughout the night, amid her smiles and teasings and coaxings and caresses and ecstasies, and all her accomplished voluptuous girlishness, the image of a resentful Holy Virgin flitted before her. Why should he burn a business telegram? Also, was he not at intervals a little absent-minded? End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. The Window. G.J. sat on the oilcloth-covered seat of the large, overhanging bay window. Below him was the river, tributary of the Severn, in front the old bridge, with an ancient street rising beyond, and above that the silhouette of the roofs of Ricton, surmounted by the spire of its vast church. To the left was the weir, and the cliffs were there also, and the last tints of the sunset. Somebody came into the coffee-room. G.J. looked round, hoping that it might, after all, be Concepcion. But it was Concepcion's maid, Emily, an imitative young woman who seemed to have caught from her former employer the quality of strange, sinister provocativeness. She paused a moment before speaking. Her thin figure was somewhat indistinct in the twilight. "Mrs. Smith wishes me to say that she will certainly be well enough to take you to the station in the morning, sir," said she in her specious tones, "but she hopes you will be able to stay to the afternoon train." "I shan't." He shook his head. "Very well, sir." And after another moment's pause, Emily, apparently with a challenging reluctance, receded through the shadows of the room and vanished. G.J. was extremely depressed and somewhat indignant. He gazed down bitterly at the water, following with his eye the incredibly long branches of the tree that from the height of the buttresses drooped perpendicularly into the water. He had had an astounding week-end, and for having responded to Concepcion's telegram, for having taken the telegram seriously, he deserved what he got. Thus he argued. She met him on the hot Saturday afternoon in a Ford car. She did not look ill. She looked as if she had very recently recovered from her acute neurasthenia. She was smartly and carelessly dressed in a summer sporting costume, and had made a strong contrast to every other human being on the platform of the small provincial station. The car drove not to the famous principal hotel, but to a small hotel just beyond the bridge. She had given him tea in the coffee room, and taken him out again on foot, showing him the town, the half-timbered houses, the immense castle, the market hall, the spacious flat-fronted residences, the multiplicity of solicitors, banks, and surveyors, the bursting provision shops with imposing fractions of animals and expensive pies, and the drapers with ladies' blouses at 2 shillings and 4pence. Then she had conducted him to an organ recital in the vast church, where, amid faint gas-jets and beadles and stalls and stained glass and holiness and centuries of history and the high respectability of the town, she had whispered sibilantly, and other people had whispered, in the long intervals of the organ. She had removed him from the church before the collection for the Red Cross, and when they had eaten a sort of dinner, she had borne him away to the Russian dancers in the Moot Hall. She said she had seen the Russian dancers once already, and that they were richly worth to him a 6 hours' train journey. The posters of the Russian dancers were rather daring and seductive. The Russian dancers themselves were the most desolating stage spectacle that G.J. had ever witnessed. The troupe consisted of intensely English girls of various ages and girl children. The costumes had obviously been fabricated by the artistes. The artistes could neither dance, pose, group, make an entrance, make an exit, or even smile. The ballets, obviously fabricated by the same persons as the costumes, had no plot, no beginning, and no end. Crude amateurishness was the characteristic of these honest and hard-working professionals, who somehow contrived to be neither men nor women, and assuredly not epicene, but who travelled from country town to country town in a glamour of posters, exciting the towns in spite of a perfect lack of sex, because they were the fabled Russian dancers. The Moot Hall was crammed with adults and their cackling offspring, who heartily applauded the show, which indeed was billed as a return visit due to terrific success on a previous occasion. "Is it not too marvellous?" Concepcion had said. He had admitted that it was, but the boredom had been excruciating. In the street they had bought an evening paper, of which he had never before heard the name, to learn news of the war. The war, however, seemed very far off. It had grown unreal. "We'll talk tomorrow," Concepcion had said, and gone abruptly to bed. Still, he had slept well in the soft climate, to the everlasting murmur of the weir. Then the Sunday. She was indisposed, could not come down to breakfast, but hoped to come down to lunch, could not come down to lunch, but hoped to come down to tea, could not come down to tea, and so on to nightfall. The Sunday had been like 1,000 years to him. He had learnt the town and the suburbs of it, the grass-grown streets, the main thoroughfares, and the slums. By the afternoon he was recognizing familiar faces in the town. He had twice made the classic round, along the cliffs, over the new bridge, which was an antique, up the hill to the castle, through the market-place, down the high street to the old bridge. He had explored the brain of the landlord, who could not grapple with a timetable, and who spent most of the time during closed hours impatiently bolting the front door, which G.J. was continually opening. He talked to the old customer, who, whenever the house was open, sat at a table in the garden over a mug of cider. He played through all the musical comedies, dance albums, and pianoforte albums that littered the piano. He had read the same Sunday papers that he read in the Albany, and he had learnt the life history of the sole servant, a very young, agreeable woman with a wedding ring and a baby, which baby she carried about with her when serving at table. Her husband was in France. She said that as soon as she had received his permission to do so, she would leave, as she really could not get through all the work of the hotel and mind and feed the baby. She said also that she played the piano herself, and she regretted that baby and pressure of work had deprived her of a sight of the Russian dancers, because she had heard so much about them, and was sure they were beautiful. This detail touched G.J.'s heart to a mysterious and sweet and almost intolerable melancholy. He had not made the acquaintance of fellow guests, for there were none, save Concepcion and Emily. And in the evening, as in the morning, the weir placidly murmured, and the river slipped smoothly between the huge jutting buttresses of the old bridge, and the thought of the perpetuity of the river, in whose mirror the venerable town was a mushroom, obsessed him, mastered him, and made him as old as the river. He was wonder-struck and sorrow-struck by life, and by his own life, and by the inconceivable and angering fantasy of Concepcion. His week-end took on the appearance of the monstrous. Then the door opened again, and Concepcion entered in a white gown, the antithesis of her sporting costume of the day before. She approached through the thickening shadows of the room, and the vague whiteness of her gown reminded him of the whiteness of the form climbing the chimney-ladder on the roof of Letchford House in the raid. Knowing her, he ought to have known that, having made him believe that she would not come down, she would certainly come down. He restrained himself, showing no untoward emotion, and said in a calm, genial voice, "Oh, I'm so glad you were well enough to come down." She sat opposite to him in the window-seat, rather sideways, so that her skirt was pulled close round her left thigh and flowed free over the right. He could see her still plainly in the dusk. "I've never yet apologized to you for my style of behaviour at the committee of yours," she began abruptly in a soft, kind, reasonable voice. "I know I let you down horribly. Yes, I did. And I ought to apologize to you for today, too. But I don't think I'll apologize to you for bringing you to Ricton and this place. They're not real, you know. They're an illusion. There's no such place as Ricton and this river and this window. There couldn't be, could there? Queen and I motored over here once from Paul, it's not so very far, and we agreed that it didn't really exist. I never forgot it. I was determined to come here again some time, and that's why I chose this very spot when half Harley Street stood up and told me I must go away somewhere after my cure and be by myself, far from the pernicious influence of friends. I think I gave you a very fair idea of the town yesterday, but I didn't show you the funniest thing in it, the inside of a solicitor's office. You remember the large grey stone house in Mill Street, the grass street, you know, with Simpover and Simpover on the brass plate, and the strip of green felt nailed all round the front door to keep the wind out in winter? Well, it's all in the same key inside. And I don't know which is the funniest, the Russian dancers or the green felt round the front door, or Mr. Simpover or the other Mr. Simpover. I'm sure neither of those men is real, though they both somehow have children. You remember the yellow cards that you see in so many of the windows? A man has gone from his house to fight for king and country. The elder Mr. Simpover thinks it would be rather boastful to put the card in the window, so he keeps it on the mantelpiece in his private office. It's for his son. And yet I assure you the father isn't real. He's like the town. He simply couldn't be real." "What have you been up to in the private office?" G.J. asked lightly. "Making my will." "What for?" "Isn't it the proper thing to do? I've left everything to you." "You haven't gone," he protested. There was absolutely no tranquillity about this woman. With her, the disconcerting unexpected happened every 5 minutes. "Did you suppose I was going to send any of my possessions back to my tropical relatives in South Africa? I've left everything to you to do what you like with. Squander it if you like, but I expect you'll give it to war charities. Anyhow, I thought it would be safest in your hands." He retorted in a tone quietly and sardonically challenging, "But I was under the impression you were cured." "Of my neurasthenia?" "Yes." "I believe I am. I gained 13 pounds in the nursing home and slept like a greengrocer. In fact, the Weir Mitchell treatment, with modern improvements, of course, enjoyed a marvellous triumph in my case. But that's not the point, G.J. I know you think I behaved very childishly yesterday, and that I deserved to be ill today for what I did yesterday. And I admit you're a saint for not saying so. But I wasn't really childish, and I haven't really been ill today. I've only been in a devil of a dilemma. I wanted to tell you something. I telegraphed for you so that I could tell you. But as soon as I saw you, I was afraid to tell you. Not afraid, but I couldn't make up my mind whether I ought to tell you or not. I've lain in bed all day trying to decide the point. Tonight I decided I oughtn't. And then all of a sudden, just now, I became an automaton and put on some things. And here I am, telling you." She paused. G.J. kept silence. Then she continued in a voice in which persuasiveness was added to calm, engaging reasonableness. "Now you must get rid of all your conventional ideas, G.J., because you're rather conventional. You must be completely straight, I mean intellectually, otherwise I can't treat you as an intellectual equal, and I want to. You must be a realist, if any man can be." She spoke almost with tenderness. He felt mysteriously shy, and with a brusque movement of the head shifted his glance from her to the river. "Well?" he questioned, his gaze fixed on the water that continually slipped in large, swirling, glinting sheets under the bridge. "I'm going to kill myself." At first the words made no impression on him. He replied, "You were right when you said this place was an illusion. It is." And then he began to be afraid. Did she mean it? She was capable of anything. And he was involved in her inescapably. Yes, he was afraid. Nevertheless, as she kept silence, he went on, with bravado, "And how do you intend to do it?" "That will be my affair. But I venture to say that my way of doing it will make Ricton historic," she said, curiously gentle. "Trust you!" he exclaimed, suddenly looking at her. "Con, why will you always be so theatrical?" She changed her posture for an easier one, half reclining. Her face and demeanour seemed to have the benign masculinity of a man's. "I'm sorry," she answered. "I oughtn't to have said that. At any rate, to you. I ought to have had more respect for your feelings." He said, "You aren't cured, that's evident. All this is physical." "Of course it's physical, G.J.," she agreed, with an intonation of astonishment that he should be guilty of an utterance so obvious and banal. "Did you ever know anything that wasn't? Did you ever even conceive anything that wasn't? If you can't show me how to conceive spirit except in terms of matter, I'd like to listen to you." "It's against nature to kill yourself." "Oh," she murmured, "I'm quite used to that charge. You aren't by any means the first to accuse me of being against nature. But can you tell me where nature ends? That's another thing I'd like to know. My dear friend, you're being conventional, and you aren't being realistic. You must know perfectly well in your heart that there's no reason why I shouldn't kill myself if I want to. You aren't going to talk to me about the 10 Commandments, I suppose, are you? There's a risk, of course, on the other side, sure, but perhaps it's worth taking. You aren't in a position to say it isn't worth taking, and at worst the other shore must be marvellous. It may possibly be terrible if you arrive too soon and without being asked, but it must be marvellous. Naturally I believe in immortality. If I didn't, the thing wouldn't be worth doing. Oh, I should hate to be extinguished. But to change one existence for another, if the fancy takes you, that seems to me the greatest proof of real independence that anybody can give. It's tremendous. You're playing chess with fate, and fate's winning, and you knock up the chessboard, and fate has to begin all over again. Can't you see how tremendous it is? And how tempting it is. The temptation is terrific." "I can see all that," said G.J. He was surprised by a sudden sense of esteem for the mighty volition hidden behind those calm, worn, gracious features. The Concepcion's body was younger than her face. He perceived, as it were for the first time, that Concepcion was immeasurably younger than himself, and yet she had passed far beyond him in experience. "But what's the origin of all this? What do you want to do it for? What's happened?" "Then you believe I mean to do it?" "Yes," he replied sincerely, and as naturally as he could. "That's the tone I like to hear," said she, smiling. "I felt sure I could count on you not to indulge in too much nonsense. Well, I'm going to try the next avatar just to remind Fate of my existence. I think Fate's forgotten me, and I can stand anything but that. I've lost Carly, and I've lost Queen. Oh, G.J., isn't it awful to think that when I offered you Queen, she'd already gone, and it was only her dead body I was offering you? And I've lost my love. And I've failed, and I shall never be any more good here. I swore I would see a certain thing through, and I haven't seen it through, and I can't. But I've told you all this before. What's left? Even my unhappiness is leaving me. Unless I kill myself, I shall cease to exist. Don't you understand?" Yes, you do. After a marked pause, she added, And I may overtake Queen. That's one thing I don't understand, he said, as we're being frank with each other. Why do you tell me? Has it occurred to you that you're really making me a party to this scheme of yours? He spoke with a perfectly benevolent attachment deriving from hers, and as he spoke he thought of a man whom he had once known and who had committed suicide, and of all that he had read about suicides and what he had thought of them. Suicides had been incomprehensible to him, and either despicable or pitiable. And he said to himself, Here is one of them, or is it an illusion? But she's made all my notions of suicide seem ridiculous. She answered his spoken question with vivacity. Why do I tell you? I don't know. That's the point I've been arguing to myself all night and all day. I'm not telling you. Something in me is forcing me to tell you. Perhaps it's much more important that you should comprehend me than that you should be spared the passing worry that I'm causing you by showing you the inside of my head. You're the only friend I have left. I knew you before I knew Carney. I practically committed suicide from my particular world at the beginning of the war. I was going back to my particular world. You remember, GJ, in that little furnished flat? I was going back to it, but you wouldn't let me. It was you who definitely cut me off from my past. I might have been gadding about safely with Sarah Churcher and her lot at this very hour, but you would have it otherwise, and so I finished up with neurasthenia. You commanded, and I obeyed. Well, he said, ignoring all her utterance except the last words, obey me again. What do you want me to do? She demanded, wistfully and yet defiantly. Her features were tending to disappear in the tide of night, but she happened to sit up and lean forward and bring them a little closer to him. You've no right to stop me from doing what I want to do. What right have you to stop me? Besides, you can't stop me. Nothing can stop me. It is settled. Everything is arranged. He too sat up and leaned forward, in a voice rendered soft by the realization of the fact that he had indeed known her before Carlos Smith knew her, and had imagined himself once to be in love with her, and of the harshness of her destiny and the fading of her glory. He said simply, and yet, in spite of himself, insinuatingly, No, I don't claim any right to stop you. I understand better, perhaps, than you think. But let me come down again next weekend. Do let me, he insisted, still more softly. Even while he was speaking, he expected her to say, You're only suggesting that in order to gain time. But she said, How can you be sure it won't be my inquest and funeral I should be letting you come down to? He replied, I could trust you. A delicate night gust charged with the scent of some plant came in at the open window and deranged ever so slightly a glistening lock on her forehead. GJ, peering at her, saw the masculinity melt from her face. He saw the mysterious resurrection of the girl in her, and felt in himself the sudden exciting outflow from her of that temperamental fluid whose springs had been dried up since the day when she learnt of her widowhood. She flushed. He looked away into the dark water as though he had profanely witnessed that which ought not to be witnessed. Earlier in the interview she had inspired him with shyness. He was now stirred, agitated, thrilled, overwhelmed by the effect on her of his own words and his own voice. He was afraid of his power, as a prophet might be afraid of his power. He had worked a miracle infinitely more convincing than anything that had led up to it. The miracle had brought back the rain of reality. Very well, she quivered. And there was a movement, and she was gone. He glanced quickly behind him, but the room lay black, a transient pallor on the blackness, and the door banged. He sat a long time, solemn, gazing at the serrated silhouette of the town against a sky that obstinately held the wraith of daylight, and listening to the everlasting murmur of the invisible weir. Not a sound came from the town, not the least sound. When at length he stumbled out, he saw the figure of the landlord smoking the pipe of philosophy, and waiting with a landlord's fatalism for the last guest to go to bed. And they talked of the weather. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. The Envoy. The next night, G.J., having been hailed by an acquaintance, was talking at the top of the steps beneath the portal of a club in Piccadilly. It was after 10 by the clocks, and nearly, but not quite, dark. A warm, rather heavy evening shower had ceased. This was the beginning of the great Mackintosh epoch, by-product of the war, when the paucity of the means of vehicular locomotion had rendered mackintoshes permissible, even for women with pretensions to smartness, and at intervals stylish girls on their way home from unaccustomed overtime passed the doors in transparent mackintoshes of pink, yellow, or green, as scornful as military officers of the effeminate umbrella, whose use was being confined to clubmen and old dowdies. The acquaintance sought advice from G.J. about the shutting up of households for Belgian refugees. G.J. answered absently, not conceding that he was in a hurry. He had in fact been held up within 3 minutes of the scene of his secret idyll, and was anxious to arrive there. He had promised himself this surprise visit to Christine as some sort of recompense and narcotic for the immense disturbance of spirit which he had suffered at Ricton. That morning Concepcion had been invisible, but at his early breakfast he had received a note from her, a brief but masterly composition, if ever so slightly theatrical. He was conscious of tenderness for Concepcion, of sympathy with her, of a desire to help to restore her to that which by misfortune she had lost. But the first of these sentiments he resolutely put aside. He was determined to change his mood towards her for the sake of his own tranquillity, and he had convinced himself that his wise, calm common sense was capable of saving her from any tragic and fatal folly. He had her in the hollow of his hand, but if she was expecting too much from him, she would be gradually disappointed. He must have peace. He could not allow a bomb to be thrown into his habits. He was a bachelor over 50, whose habits had the value of inestimable jewels, and whose perfect independence was the most precious thing in the world. At his age he could not marry a volcano, a revolution, a new radioactive element exhibiting properties which were an enigma to social science. Concepcion would turn his existence into an endless drama of which she alone, with her deep-rooted devilish talent for the sensational, would always choose the setting, as she had chosen the window and the weir. No, he must not mistake affectionate sympathy for tenderness, nor tolerate the sexual exploitation of his pity. As he listened and talked to the acquaintance, his inner mind shifted with relief to the vision of Christine, contented and simple and compliant in her nest. Christine, at once restful and exciting. Christine, the exquisite symbol of acquiescence and response. What a contrast to Concepcion! It had been a bold and sudden stroke to lift Christine to another plane, but a stroke well justified and entirely successful, fulfilling his dream. At this moment he noticed a figure pass the doorway in whose shadow he was, and he exclaimed within himself incredulously, "That is Christine!" In the shortest possible delay he said good night to his acquaintance, and jumped down the steps and followed eastwards the figure. He followed warily, for already the strange and distressing idea had occurred to him that he must not overtake her, if she it was. It was she. He caught sight of her again in the thick obscurity by the prison wall of Devonshire House. He recognized the peculiar brim of the new hat and the new military umbrella held on the wrist by a thong. What was she doing abroad? She could not be going to a theatre. She had not a friend in London. He was her London, and La Mère Gaston was not with her. Theoretically, of course, she was free. He laid down no law. But it had been clearly understood between them that she should never emerge at night alone. She herself had promulgated the rule, for she had a sense of propriety and a strong sense of reality. She belonged to the class which respectable, broad-minded women, when they bantered G.J., always called the pretty ladies, and as a postulant for respectability she had for her own satisfaction to mind her P's and Q's. She could not afford not to keep herself above suspicion. She had been a courtesan. Did she look like one? As an individual figure in repose, no. None could have said that she did. He had long since learnt that to decide always correctly by appearance, and apart from environment and gesture, whether an unknown woman was or was not a wanton, presented a task beyond the powers of even the completest experience. But Christine was walking in Piccadilly at night, and he soon perceived that she was discreetly showing the demeanour of a courtesan at her profession, she who had hated and feared the pavement. He knew too well the signs, the waverings, the turns of the head, the variations in speed, the scarcely perceptible hesitations, the unmistakable air of wandering with no definite objective. Near Dover Street he hastened through the thin reflecting mire, amid beams of light and illuminated numbers that advanced upon him in both directions, thundering or purring, and crossed Piccadilly and hurried ahead of her to watch her in safety from the other side of the thoroughfare. He could hardly see her. She was only a moving shadow, but still he could see her, and in the long stretch of gloom beneath the facade of the Royal Academy he saw the shadow pause in front of a military figure, which by a flank movement avoided the shadow and went resolutely forward. He lost her in front of the Piccadilly Hotel, and found her again at the corner of Eyre Street. She swerved into Eyre Street and crossed Regent Street. He was following. In Denman Street, close to Shaftesbury Avenue, she stood still in front of another military figure, a common soldier as it proved, who also rebuffed her. The thing was flagrant. He halted, and deliberately let her go from his sight. She vanished into the dark crowds of the avenue. In horrible humiliation, in atrocious disgust, he said to himself, "Never would I set eyes on her again. Never, never." Why was she doing it? Not for money. She could only be doing it from the nostalgia of adventurous debauch. She was the slave of her temperament, as the drunkard is the slave of his thirst. He had told her that he would be out of town for the week-end, on committee business. He distinctly told her that she must on no account expect him on the Monday night. And her temperament had roused itself from the obscene groves of her subconsciousness, like a tiger, and come up and driven her forth. How easy for her to escape from La Mère Gaston, if she chose. And yet, would she dare, even at the bidding of the tiger, to introduce a stranger into the flat? Unnecessary, he reflected. There were 100 accommodating dubious interiors between Shaftesbury Avenue and Leicester Square. He understood. He neither accused nor pardoned, but he was utterly revolted, and wounded not merely in his soul, but in the most sensitive part of his soul, his pride. He called himself by the worst epithet of opprobrium, simpleton. The bold and sudden stroke had now become the fatuous caprice of a damned fool. Had he, at his age, been capable of overlooking the elementary axiom, once a wrong 'un, always a wrong 'un? Had he believed in reclamation? He laughed out his disgust. No, he did not blame her. To blame her would have been ridiculous. She was only what she was, and not worth blame. She was nothing at all. How right, how cursedly right, were the respectable dames in the accent of amused indifference which they employed for their precious phrase, the pretty ladies. Well, he would treat her generously, but through his lawyer. And in the desolation, the dismay, the disillusion, the nausea which ravaged him, he was unwillingly conscious of fragments of thoughts that flickered like transient flames far below in the deep mines of his being. "You are an astounding woman, Con. Do you want me to go to the bad altogether?" In offering him Queen, had not Concepcion made the supreme double sacrifice of attempting to bring together, at the price of her own separation from both of them, the two beings to whom she was most profoundly attached? It was a marvellous deed. Worry, volcanoes, revolutions, was he afraid of them? Were they not the very essence of life? Figure of nobility! Sitting there now by the window over the river, listening to the Wear, "I shall never be any more good." But she never had a gesture that was not superb. Was he really encrusted in habits, really like men whom he knew and despised at his club? She loved him, and what rich, flattering love was her love compared to... She was young. Tenderness. Such were the flames of dim promise that nickered immeasurably beneath the dark devastation of his mind. He ignored them, but he could not ignore them. He extinguished them, but they were continually relighted. A wedding? What sort of a wedding? Poor Carlos, pathetically buried under the ruthless happiness of others. What a shame! Poor Carlos! Nice enough little cocotte, nothing else, but of course incurable. He remembered all her crimes now, how she had been late in dressing for their first dinner, her inexplicable vanishing from the supper party, never explained, but easily explicable now, perhaps, and so on and so on. Simpleton. Ass. He had walked heedless of direction. He was near Letchford House. Many of its windows were lit, the great front doors were open, a commissionaire stood on the guard in front of them. To the railings was affixed a newly painted notice. No person will be allowed to enter these premises without a pass. To this rule there is no exception. Letchford House had been taken over in its entirety by a government department that believed in the virtue of mystery and of long hours. He looked up at the higher windows. He could not distinguish the chimney amid the newly revealed stars. He thought of Queen, the white woman. Evidently he had never understood Queen, for if Concepcion admired her, she was worth admiration. Concepcion never made a mistake in assessing fundamental character. The complete silent absorption of Letchford House into the war machine rather dismayed him. He had seen not a word as to the affair in the newspapers, and Letchford House was one of the final strongholds of privilege. He strolled on into the quietness of the park, of which one of the gatekeepers said to him that it would be shutting in a few minutes. He was in solitude and surrounded by London. He stood still, and the vast sea of war seemed to be closing over him. The war was growing, or the sense of its measureless scope was growing. It had sprung, not out of this crime or that, but out of the secret, invisible roots of humanity, and it was widening to the limits of evolution itself. It transcended judgment, it defied conclusions, and rendered equally impossible both hope and despair. His pride in his country was intensified as months passed. His faith in his country was not lessened. And yet, wherein was the efficacy of grim words about British tenacity? The great new Somme offensive was not succeeding in the north. Was victory possible? Was victory deserved? In his daily labour he was brought into contact with too many instances of official selfishness, folly, ignorance, stupidity, and sloth, French as well as British, not to marvel at times that the conflict had not come to an ignominious end long ago through simple lack of imagination. He knew that he himself had often failed in devotion, in rectitude, in sheer grit. The supreme lesson of the war was its revelation of what human nature actually was. And the solace of the lesson, the hope for triumph, lay in the fact that human nature must be substantially the same throughout the world. If we were humanly imperfect, so at least was the enemy. Perhaps the frame of society was about to collapse. Perhaps Queen, deliberately courting destruction and being destroyed, was the symbol of society. What matter? Perhaps civilization, by its nobility and its elements of reason, and by the favour of destiny, would be saved from disaster after frightful danger, and Concepcion was its symbol. All he knew was that he had a heavy day's work before him on the morrow, and in relief from pain and insoluble problems, he turned to face that work, thankful. Thankful that, owing originally to Queen, he had discovered in the war a task which suited his powers, which was genuinely useful, and which would only finish with the war. Thankful for the prospect of meeting Concepcion at the weekend and exploring with her the marvellous provocative potentialities that now drew them together. Thankful, too, that he had a balanced and sagacious mind, and could judge justly. Yes, he was already forgetting his bitter condemnation of himself as a simpleton. How in his human self-sufficiency could he be expected to know that he had judged the negligible Christine unjustly? Was he divine, that he could see in the figure of the wanton who peered at soldiers in the street a self-convinced mystic envoy of the most clement Virgin, an envoy passionately repentant after apostasy, bound at all costs to respond to an imagined voice long unheard and seeking, though in vain this second time, the protégé of the Virgin, so that she might once more succour and assuage his affliction? End of chapter 41. End of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett.